Hello.
And welcome to our first recorded note session on evolution.
Yes, we are going to be talking about the history behind how the theory of natural selection was founded today, more so about the theory of natural selection.
Our first slide talks about pre-Darwinian views. So these ideas are all previous to what Charles Darwin kind of reported and how he established some of his findings.
Yeah, so this was before people really knew what was going on in terms of evolution. So they thought that the Earth was about 6,000 years old. We know now that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. And people, scientists included, thought that species were fixed in their appearance and did not change over time. So they did not think that any species were evolving or changing at all.
And this obviously changed due to the fossil record. So we're taking a look at a picture of, it looks like a pterodactyl. And these fossils helped shape ideas about how species and organisms did evolve on our planet.
Yes, it's one of the biggest pieces of evidence for evolution is being able to look at the fossil record. There are certain organisms where you can actually see the transitions change throughout millions of years, and you can see little bones changing. So the fossil record is our big clue here. So Charles Darwin got his information from some scientists. He took findings from a lot of different people. Two people that really influenced him were these geologists, Charles Lyell and James Hutton. They believed that the earth was very old, and they believed in what is called gradualism, which is one of our vocabulary words. And it is the slow and steady changes that can add up to great changes over many years. So Darwin took this idea of gradualism and he used that as the starting point for his theory.
So now you see pre-Darwin views versus now what Charles Darwin is reporting.
Yes.
And that gradualism is an idea that is going to kind of take off because species and organisms are gradually changing over a period of time when you look at the fossil record.
Yes. So something else that was really noticed by early scientists is the geological changes. We have Pangea way back in the day where the continents separated.
And you're going to see the formation of land masses through volcanic activity. You're going to see those plate tectonics take place because you're going to have land masses jamming up into each other and forming mountains, and then obviously even continents shifting and breaking apart and slowly moving away from each other over long millions of years, periods of time.
Right. So it started with his voyage. So Darwin went on the HMS Beagle at the age of 22, and he began a 5-year voyage around the world, which is just so cool to me.
You can see this is mapping Darwin's voyage.
Yes. So he went all over the world and he visited many different continents and many different islands for 5 years, and he recorded all of his observations.
So I think it's really important to understand that Darwin's 22 years old. Science is not super advanced at this point, and all of his findings are really based off of his curiosity and empirical data. So he's observing a lot of things he's very interested in different continents, and drawing conclusions based off the evidence that he's finding and observing in different organisms.
Yes. So one of the big groundbreaking points of his trip was in the Galapagos Islands. He stopped there, and what he did, this is actually an excerpt from his book, The Origin of Species, and it says, most of the organic productions are aboriginal creations found nowhere else. There is even a difference between the inhabitants of the different islands, yet all show a marked relationship with those of America. So what this is saying is, even on islands that are separated by water, there are organisms that show some types of relationships on the island and on like the mainland. And so these are animals that cannot swim, they cannot fly. And so this really made him think, well, how are these organisms related and what happened?
How did they even get there?
Right. So he noticed 3 distinct patterns of biodiversity.
Species vary globally. Australia, South America, and Africa are similar organisms, but different species. Species vary locally. Different yet related species live in different ecological conditions. And then 3, species vary over time. Collected fossils of ancient organisms similar and different from modern day species.
Yes. And just a reminder, biodiversity is really important, and it's just the differences between organisms and species. So What he realized is these finches. So on the Galapagos Island, he studied 14 different species of finches. So these are all separate species, but they're all considered finches. And he noticed that each of these species had special adaptations for different lifestyles. So what he realized is these finches were all very similar except for their beak sizes. You have beak sizes that are really big, like right here, but with a short length. And then he had really long beaks that were not thick. So if you were a finch that had a skinny beak with a long length, you were able to get to smaller seeds in tighter spaces. If you are a finch with bigger beak, you're able to break bigger seeds and get bigger seeds. So, what Darwin realized from observing these finches is that they all have a common ancestor, and they started evolving these different adaptations to fit different niches because of the food available on the island.
That is really becoming a specialized adaptation for its environment to allow the survival of the species based on seasonal conditions as well. So, if it's a really, really rainy season and you have a bumper crop of said seed that is really beneficial for a finch that's got a short beak and it's really good at crushing big seeds, they're obviously going to flourish, whereas the other finches might not do as well. So populations will go up and down based off of seasonal conditions, thus ensuring the survival of said species because of their specialization.
Yes. This is also really important because the finches are on an island and so they're separated from the mainland. So they cannot like interbreed with any other species. They can't leave this island. So whatever ancestor came over to this island, so all of these finches had a common ancestor and then they were all stuck here. They had to diversify in order to survive. And that is how the species evolved. So, Charles Darwin took all of this information and all of his findings and he went back to England where he searched for how to explain how they're changing over time. So, he worked for the next 20 years to collect all of this evidence for his ideas.
Artificial selection. Darwin observed many variations of pigeons. He selected certain desirable traits, and these traits were inherited by the offspring.
So, what he decided to do with this, he decided to mimic what was happening in nature with the finches. So, the beak sizes were determined by the seeds available for these finches. So, the environment was kind of picking what beaks were favorable and which would survive. So instead of having the environment do it, Darwin is doing it here. So he was looking at the color of the pigeon, the length of the legs, the size of the beak, and he was picking desirable traits and he was breeding those pigeons. So the next generation would look like the traits that he was picking. So he was being the environment here.
And it's much like we would be if you're a dog breeder. And how you might prefer a big dog versus a small dog or a medium-sized dog, a dog that might shed or does not shed, a lap dog versus a working dog. There's so many different things that we continue to determine in what we like to see in our genetics of animals.
Yes. So Darwin was also influenced by scientist Thomas Malthus. He studied human populations. He really studied like tragedy of the commons, things like that. And his big thing was Thomas said in the future, the human population is growing much faster than the world's food supply. So Darwin took this idea and he kind of applied it to animals because humans are animals as well. And so he asked the question, do animals also tend to overproduce? And this is where he came up with the idea of natural selection. Natural selection is going to explain the process of evolution and how organisms change over time.
Natural selection states that there is much variation within a population.
So this goes back to biodiversity. In order for natural selection to act on a population, the first thing that it needs biodiversity. It needs those variations in individuals to be able to choose which would be most beneficial. Choose isn't the right word I want to use there because they can't choose, but I hope you understand what I mean.
Organisms produce more offspring than can survive. So obviously this is an environmental adaptation because we know that not all the offspring are going to survive from either lack of food, predation, obviously weather, environmental conditions are going to depend on that. So obviously, most organisms do have a larger offspring. Like rabbits will obviously have more babies. Insects have a ton because they're on the bottom of the food chain.
Mhm.
But they want to ensure the survival of their offspring and their genetics. So therefore, they're obviously going to have more offspring than they potentially need.
This also goes for predators too. I just watched a documentary on this, and even like think about bears, they have 2 or 3 cubs, sometimes only one survives.
Right.
Or tigers have 2 or 3 cubs, only one survives. So they instinctually know that all of their offspring probably won't survive, but they need at least one of them to make it.
There is a struggle for survival. We just kind of talked about that.
Yes. So there needs to be competition, like Mr. Harms said, for resources, for habitat, for food, water, breeding, anything like that.
Individuals that have favorable variations will survive and reproduce at a greater rate.
So all of these adaptations and these things that are favorable have to give that individual a greater chance at surviving and reproducing. So these adaptations are making it more successful for them to pass on their genes, which is the goal of life.
And if you take a look at this image, I mean, you have a red stag or an elk. It's got this awesome set of antlers that they use to defend their territory for breeding rights. They are obviously in a small group because they stay together, therefore have more eyes on predation, and they're able to secure each other. So they're all like adapted perfectly for their environment based off of competition.
And it's beautiful.
Yeah.
And it results in adaptations. So if you look at the top picture right here, this is actually a butterfly wing. So butterflies have adapted to have these spots on their wings that mimic owl eyes. So that way when they sit on trees, a predator will think it's an owl.
And they will not try to eat an owl.
No,
so
they
therefore
won't.
they're going to leave that moth alone. And in this lower picture, you see this awesome picture of it looks like a cicada, but it also looks like a thorn. So that cicada is mimicking a portion of that branch, and therefore saving itself from predation. So
Yes.
it's a unique way for survival to happen.
Yes. So natural selection explains how organisms change over time. There has to be much variation within the population. Organisms have to produce more offspring than survive. There needs to be a struggle for survival, so this is competition. And organisms with those favorable variations or adaptations will survive and pass on those traits to their offspring. The result of natural selection is that organisms become adapted to their environment.
Perfect.
If there are any questions, you can ask Mr. Harnson and I. We hope that you are filling out your note sheet as we did this. We would like for you to submit your note sheet and then move on to the next part of our activity.